Well, welcome to the Introduction to Ecosystems course and the live question and answer session. And I'd like to thank everybody who's posted questions. We've had a lot to look through and some really fascinating topics have come up. Some of the questions very specific, others really taking the widest possible of global views. For example, somebody has asked whether the Open University's got any anything going on tree management, and we have the monster map of trees called Treezilla, which aims to map trees all over the country, and clearly that is going to contribute to local ecosystems management. But many of the questions could be grouped together because you were asking about similar things. Connected into this is Drew Purves from the British Ecological Society, and he's been looking through your questions and he's now able to give an overview of some of the general points that have come up. Drew.
Okay, yes, I would reiterate what David said, that the questions are very variable and some of them very broad, and that's really interesting to see because you know, I'm someone that's been studying ecology and ecological sciences for a while, but what's exciting is to see that the people that have signed on to this course are clearly very interested in thinking about the applied aspects of this. So not just studying ecosystems, but protecting them and you know, hopefully creating a global sustainable future for us all. So that's great to see, although it does make it more challenging. Some of these questions are really challenging. So, what it seemed to me we could divide the questions into sort of 4 sections really. Some of them are about the challenges to ecosystem health and sustainability globally. Another set is about then the goals, to say, well, given those challenges, what are we actually trying to achieve? What would we like to achieve? The understanding of ecosystems, so whatever it is we're trying to achieve, we're going to need to understand different aspects of the system to do that. And finally, the strategies that we could roll out in terms of, for instance, local ecosystem management, but also some even broader questions about our global approach to things like economic development, you know, sustainable growth, and so on. So perhaps if I could just run through for 5 or 10 minutes those, David, and then me and you could take some specific questions. So if we look at the challenges, for example, Noel Mary Gardner said, on the eve of the new millennium in the BBC TV programme State of the Planet, David Attenborough identified 5 major threats to biodiversity due to human activities. And she lists those. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. So 15 years on, what is the current state of the planet? Has any progress been made, or is the situation more serious? And I think that helps to set the tone a bit. Joe Lewis said, what forms the greatest threat to our ecosystems? Whereas Martin Naylor asked an even broader question, said, what chance is there of turning the planet sterile due to at least 20 years of various problems? And by sterile, I take it to mean no life at all. So they're the challenges we're facing. We look at the goals. More of the questions really are about goals. And you know, is our goal, for instance, conservation, keeping things as they are? And Philip Allen said, you know, in any given area, should the rarest, most neglected habitats get the most conservation support? Or should we think about conservation maintaining, including human management? So should we try to maintain management, like you heard in the coppicing story? On the other hand, we can think about perhaps trying to restore ecosystems to some idea of a previous, more pristine state, which includes the idea of rewilding. And Jeanette Higgins asked, I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts about reintroducing animals and birds to areas where they've previously died out for various reasons. But all of that, the idea of keeping things as they are or restoring them to the past, Tony Richards had a question to say, but don't we run the risk of embalming systems to the point where there can be no further evolution? So it stagnates and becomes a theme park. And so really, if we think perhaps more proactively into the future, we could think about trying to future-proof ecosystems, so things like climate change, or recognize the fact that some species have come to benefit from human activity. So both Fran Moore and Anne-Marie Aitken asked questions about species that have benefited from human activities. Whereas Trina Fennick, for example, said, if polar bears are too suffering the Arctic in the future, why can't we introduce them into the Antarctic? And then finally, we might think, well, maybe it's not preserving them as they are, or as they were, or preserving them for the future. But what about ecosystem services? That would be a case of preserving them for ourselves. So Niel Becerra asked, how can the provision of ecosystem services be incorporated into conservation planning? Then there are a set of questions next about our understanding of ecosystems. And I won't go through them in quite so much detail because I'm going to come back to some, but questions about interactions, the complexity and scaling of ecosystems and so on. That's very interesting, and that's something that I've thought a bit about, so I'm going to come back to those. Then we go on to the strategies, and in terms of the strategies on the ground, we have things like, should we adopt a laissez-faire approach to say, perhaps nature's so adaptable that we can just leave it to its own devices and it will naturally protect itself? Or we can think of what so-called fortress conservation. So that's the idea that we create protected areas. That was an issue raised by Lisa Brooks. We need to have more areas of protected ocean or more areas managed with the ecosystem approach. But equally, we can think about intervening a lot more. And that again brings up this idea of rewilding. And Lucy Weller brought up the idea of biological control, where we deliberately try to introduce a new species in order to control another. Very interesting, controversial topic with a checkered history. The second set of strategy questions really, I think, are about this broader picture of thinking about ecosystems and ecosystem services in the context of the global economy, an economy dominated by, for instance, large corporations and wealthy nations and so on. And at that scale, again, we can think about laissez-faire. That term comes from economics. Should we just let the markets deal with it? If ecosystems are so valuable, they should price them properly, and off we go. But I think many of us would be quite skeptical about that, including Dan Field, who says, from what I read and see, it seems money will always win out when it comes to preserving a rainforest. Are we fighting a losing battle against those businesses that have too much power, financial and government backing? So that then leads into issues of regulation of the economy in order to protect nature. That could be through taxes, or it could be through some or other policies, or hard regulation like protected species and protected areas, or more unusual market interventions like creating new markets for ecosystem services, like we see in the REDD+ schemes, where countries might be able to pay each other to protect forests and so on. And we can perhaps go through some of those. So for instance, Teresa Mathai says, is there an attractive way you could engage the emerging economies of the East in conservation efforts? And David Pereira says, how can we fix the ecosystem for our planet when we have the corporations and governments only interested in making a fast buck today, as he says? How can we get them to invest in the future? If we can't get them all on board working together, we have no chance of making a future for future generations. So what these people are arguing about, David and Teresa, are that we should really engage with the economic process to try to steer it toward a better end. Christine Damy raises the issue of ecosystem services and valuing. She says, are you aware of any studies that have placed any kind of value, monetary or otherwise, on different species? And on we go, but perhaps several people have brought up the ultimate issue in a sense, which is maybe the way to address this is through education, winning hearts and minds. And there are actually a surprising number of questions on education. So for example, how can humans suitably be informed of the consequences of how we lived, where our timber comes from, the extent of our fishing of the oceans? That was from Dan Field. Or Sandra Easom, people need to understand that all life is interconnected. Could this knowledge, coupled with better education, be the key to more awareness and more action to protect biodiversity? And so hopefully that gives you some idea of the breadth of the topics, and there are also 2 or 3 special topics that don't quite fit into that scheme, I think. So permaculture, very interesting. Gaia theory, very interesting. And this idea of whether humans are just another species. So maybe we'll get onto those if we have time. But I hope that's a useful overview. It's certainly very thought-provoking for me.
Yes, thank you very much, Drew. And perhaps we should answer some specific questions from people now. One of the things that we've concentrated on in ecosystems is the understanding of ecosystems and the need to understand before you can take meaningful decisions. And Rachel Lewis asked about studying animal behavior and ecosystems. Should that study go hand in hand with studying the ecosystem and provide better results? And I think that's certainly animal behavior is very important if you're studying an ecosystem. If you think about the rock pool example that we gave early on, people collect seaweed from the shore, but of course the seaweed acts as a haven for an awful lot of small insects on which birds like turnstones depend for food. So the harvesting of the seaweed has to be done in a sort of sensitive way, so as not to deprive these seabirds of their essential food source. Drew, do you want to select one?
Oh, well, actually, I mean, I would second that as well, David. And for me, that question also points to what I would think of as being one of the largest challenges, which is understanding how the ecology and biology and interactions among all of those separate organisms somehow leads to the aggregate structure of ecosystems that we see. And that's a question that we're really only just starting to chip away at. You know, I mean, as you said, we've got lots of interesting studies at each level. So it's quite right that the details of how individual animals behave and interact with each other actually affects things like, you know, the overall trophic pyramid or the robustness of an ecosystem to something like climate change. And that's just a real challenge. It's kind of what's exciting about ecosystem ecology, but it's also what's very challenging about it. It's trying to relate those micro patterns and studies to the larger scale. I mean, another example of that I thought was quite interesting was from Francis McShane, who said, "Is salt or lack of it a problem for organisms in the desert?" I'm thinking of the advice for Western visitors to take salt tablets when they visit hot countries. And now, as a specific question, I'll be honest, I don't know too much about that, but I do know there are in the inland tropics, for example, in Central Africa, you have areas, very old soils where there's been a lot of drainage of the salt, and it is the case that a lot of animals seek out salt licks and so on. But the larger point there is that it reminds us that we shouldn't reduce ecosystems to something simple as just energy or carbon or matter. There's more going on than just energy held in carbon when we think about ecosystems. And the area of study that looks at that is stoichiometry. And so, for example, most of the world's herbivores are much more concerned about getting enough nitrogen than they are just getting enough carbon. And as Francis's question highlights, even if you've got enough of your macronutrients, so your carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and so on, animals can still be short of micronutrients like salts. And so again, unfortunately, it's another complication, but it's just a reminder to not be too simplistic in thinking about things like food chains and trophic pyramids as just about energy.
And I've seen elephants in Botswana licking away at an exposure on a rock face, presumably because that was providing a source of salt.
Yes, and of course, you know, then the knock-on effects of that are very interesting. I mean, this is, again, it's very exciting because then you think that will cause aggregations of elephants together in the same place. And how does that affect their relationships with each other and so on, right? So, I mean, there'll probably be knock-on effects of that.
And you begin to build quite an interesting food chain there because the elephant species contain a lot of seeds, and you get baboons following the elephants, combing through the feces to get the seeds.
That's right, and it's just all of this is so interesting, isn't it? Really, that's the thing. I think. I mean, the challenge is when we set these things in the broader context of the applications is somehow trying to work out which of these interactions are the key ones to consider in a certain place, and which ones are still interesting and worthy of study, but perhaps we can set to one side for the time being. You know, and that's something that you know, you need to look at each case separately, and I don't think you can generalize too much to say it. So it may be, for example, that the salt licks and the interactions there are very important in that area or in that area of Africa, let's say, but it may be completely different in, for instance, a temperate grassland or you know, somewhere else. And so it's interesting.
Yes, going off a slight tangent, Linda and indeed Rachel asked about how you can make children interested in nature, and it is very often the stories like the one we've just been talking about with salt licks, elephants, and so on, and baboons. These are the stories that bring nature to life.
Yes, no, I think that's right, and the it is just fascinating. I'm sure a lot of the people on this course, and you know, you and I, David, would have been quite inspired by books or documentaries like the David Attenborough documentaries. It's been fantastic for getting people interested in nature. And I do think that, you know, again, in this broader scheme, one of the things I'm concerned about is this increasing detachment of people from nature. And so just at the time, you could argue, where the global human population and the global economy needs to be thinking about ecosystems more than ever before, because we're threatening them to a much greater extent than at any time in the past. This unfortunately is coinciding with the process of urbanization and so on, which is separating people from nature, and in some ways that gives us this uphill struggle when we think about trying to introduce economic policies or conservation policies, that we're up against this emotional detachment, and of course trying to reach children, but in fact adults too, and to re-engage them with nature is, it's easy to say and difficult to do. But what's great, we can see in this course here, so many people signed on to this course, that it shows you that there is appetite for it. So.
Yes, where should we go to next?
Oh, well, I guess perhaps returning to the top, there was one question, this is from Joe Lewis, what forms the greatest threat to our ecosystems? And I thought that might be worth going through, because I think it's probably fair to say that compared to a lot of other questions, there's a fair degree of agreement about this one. I mean, if we look at globally, it's at the moment it's very clear that land use change and habitat loss is the single largest threat to ecosystems worldwide. That would probably be followed by overhunting, so harvesting of wildlife like bushmeat hunting in the tropics, or overfishing. I mean, something like 90% of fisheries worldwide are now either overexploited or fully exploited, according to the latest estimate. And so I think that in terms of the short-term effects, they would be most of them. Invasive species is an interesting one, because that's probably something where we know that there have been a lot of species that have invaded, and we know that that's caused large changes in ecosystems. Interestingly, it tends to not have caused many extinctions. The recent evidence shows that it tends not to do that. So it seems that there's a lot of space to insert new species into ecosystems. But of course, you can't necessarily reduce the damage to an ecosystem as to the species that have been driven extinct. So, if the species, a lot of the resident species might be reduced in abundance a lot, so to sort of residual populations, and displaced by this invader. And so it's still a large effect on the ecosystem. But that's a bit more of a complicated one, but nonetheless, so land use change, direct hunting, and invasive species are probably are agreed to be the most pressing immediate threats. Interestingly, though, I think in the longer term, climate change is obviously something that we're worried about. And right now, there's no way that climate change is anything like as pressing a problem as these other things. And one of the questions, I'm not sure I can find it right now, but said, there's been perhaps an undue concentration on climate change, and I think that's correct. It's not the greatest pressure right now, but one of the reasons we care about it so much is because over a sort of, say, if we go 50 years into the future, it could have absolutely dramatic effects on ecosystems. And now all of these threats are likely to be different magnitudes in different places. And so it's not going to be a one size fits all, but for example, we expect climate change to be much more pronounced at high latitudes. And so that's why we would think that high latitude ecosystems are particularly susceptible to climate change. But so I think it's good for people to have that kind of overview in their mind of those key pressures, all of which of course ultimately follow from human population growth and increases in consumption of humans. So it's not population growth per se that matters, but the increased amount of material that we're extracting from the world, the energy use and use of land and so on is what is ultimately driving all of these threats, including invasive species, which of course occur because we travel around the world so much and accidentally introduce them everywhere. But
yes, invasive species are a very interesting subject area. I know somebody mentioned the Japanese knotweed and whether we really ought to try and find ways of tolerating it rather than removing it. And there's also issues about what is truly an invasive species, because some species will invade naturally. Collared doves, I suppose, are an example of some of the species, not necessarily a threatening one that's just appeared.
Yes, I mean, I think actually invasive species are interesting in every way, both in terms of those applied questions. So when should we be worried, and when should we view it as a natural thing? And also actually scientifically, it's a really interesting challenge to be able to understand why, I mean, the vast majority of introductions of species don't succeed. So most of the time, if you were to, release a few mammals and mice or something out of your window, that population will die out 99.99% of the time. But just now and again, one will take off and just go crazy. And we don't have any ability really to predict which species would take off and which wouldn't. And there's some recent work trying to look at the general patterns to see whether, for instance, species with that are fast breeding, for example, or species that are generalists rather than specialists invade. And so there's some sign of this, but it's quite a recent science. As to the sort of the more applied side, to say when should we be worried, I think there's there are some cases. I think that, for instance, the parrots in London are a good example where it seems to be, as far as I can see, that the consensus seems to be that parrots have established in London and it hasn't really done any harm whatsoever. That seems to be the case. People have looked at the effects and they don't seem to have displaced any native species and so on. So sometimes I suppose we would just say it's kind of a harmless thing. But then there are other examples where
expressed concerns about large numbers of parrots arriving and stripping plants. So there's somebody who's identified a downside to them.
Okay, right, yeah, fair enough. I mean, I suppose that's right. It would be a bit silly to say there are none, but at least on aggregate, I suppose, it looks like it's caused very, very little trouble. Whereas you'd have cases at the other end of the spectrum, like the famous zebra mussels in the lake states in the US, where they've just caused, untold, tens of millions of dollars worth of damage, and so you have this spectrum. And I think a lot of the time, some of these issues become a bit clearer when you look on a case-by-case basis. So it's perhaps very hard to generalize any scheme to say when you should be worried and when you shouldn't. But sometimes you look and you go, oh, this really looks like something we would want to try to prevent, and sometimes not. So I think that's a general message, really, that sometimes these questions make a lot more sense when you look at a particular case study than they do in terms of any broad general answer. If I could tell a slightly amusing story, David, just for a second, which I think is quite indicative for invasive species, indicative of the challenge of working out what to do, is the the American crayfish and the European crayfish in Britain, which I think is really interesting because all the evidence shows that the European crayfish wasn't in Britain until something like 1400, but maybe as late as 1500 or so. And then more recently, the American crayfish has arrived. So the question is the American crayfish an invasive species that's displacing a native species, or is it an invasive species that's displacing another invasive? And legally, in EU law, it depends. They have a cutoff of 1500, the year 1500. So say if it was before 1500, it was native, and if it was after 1500, it's invasive. So you have this crazy thing, really, which is the European crayfish is interesting because it's right on the cusp. So you say if it was here in 1450, we have a legal obligation to protect it against the American crayfish. If it arrived in 1550, we have a legal obligation to eradicate it. Okay, so it shows you the challenges, and it's not to humiliate, not to in any way. I mean, the EU is doing its best, but these issues are complicated, and they're trying to come up with decent rules. But it shows you the challenge, really, which is that nature is always changing and things are moving around, and so it's no easy answers anyway.
No, they're not. And one of the other subjects that has come up has been destruction of ecosystems, particularly in connection with logging, and the fairly recent example of the Australian government's move to deregister part of the Tasmanian forest, which is currently a World Heritage Site, so that it can be logged. It sounds a pretty frightening prospect, that you actually destroy that which is at the moment is pristine forest that is goes back quite a long way. So how you value that as against the value for logging, and apparently 66,000 people employed in the logging industry. It's quite an interesting problem, but I mean, from an ecosystem's point of view, it doesn't sound the best way to conserve.
No, I mean, and I must admit, there are two parts of my brain: the sort of analytical, rational part, and the more immediate, instinctive part. And of course, the instinctive part says, "No, come on, that's crazy." I mean, how could you, don't, please, just, there's so little pristine forest, let's keep it. Of course. And I hope that's how it ends up in the end. On the other hand, of course, if you take a broader, take a more analytical view of it, I suppose you would say, well, for example, Britain, lowland England, let's say, would naturally be mostly forested, we think. But by the time the Romans arrived, 2,000 years ago or more, it was about 15%. So we'd already got rid of 85% of our forest by the time they arrived. and we slowly chipped away at the remaining 10%, and we've got about 5% left. So you can see why a skeptic would say, well, what right do we have then to tell some other country that they're not allowed to cut down their forest? And to be fair, I think at least you should understand that argument. You should understand that counter argument. Personally, I don't think it is convincing for several reasons. I mean, one is the people that did that back then probably didn't have much of a choice. Those ancient Britons that cut down those forests, they didn't have any other way to satisfy their demand for wood or demand for food. And secondly, nowadays we know the knock-on dangers of that. We know, for instance, that deforestation contributes carbon dioxide, which exacerbates climate change. We know that it will cause biodiversity loss, and all those things. That wasn't in any way in the brains of those ancient people. So, and finally, I do think that, if I'm honest, and I hope this isn't too controversial, but Australia is quite a wealthy country as well, and I do think we ought to at least acknowledge that there are countries, a lot of the countries where the tropical deforestation is occurring at the moment are much worse off than us. And then that changes the argument, because then we have to say, well, how can we enable you to develop economically to the same point as us without going through that same environmental degradation? There's a concept of the Koch, I think it's called the Koch curve in economics, which is, with economic development, the environment first gets worse and then in some ways gets better after a while. And there's this idea that, can we help developing countries to sort of avoid that intermediate stage, that we went through, for instance, in the 19th century, where a lot of our terrible pollution and so on, can we help them? So quite a complicated issue, but I think it would be nice if somehow the Australian government was to find some other solution to enable those people to thrive economically and to satisfy their demand of wood. But let's hope.
And I was just looking to try and pick up who had asked a question about the recent controversy about Chris Peckham and David Attenborough and their views on conservation. But it did raise the interesting question about where you spend limited resources on conservation. Do you try and conserve certain key iconic species, or do you put money into conservation at a habitat level?
Yes. I mean, this is a really important question. Just the overall approach to conservation. As I said, I mean, actually, the way I really only outlined one axis earlier, which is kind of an axis from trying to restore things to how they were in the past, to maintaining them how they are now, to looking into the future to perhaps future-proof them. But there's quite another axis, which is, are we thinking at the species level, or the habitat level, or all the way up to the ecosystem level, and so on. And some of these questions, you can see that depending on the view you took, you come up with a very different answer. And I think that the direction of travel at the moment seems to be that we're at least not exactly leaving species-based conservation behind, but certainly I think most people in conservation now would recognize that we need to do more than just have a list of species that we protect. But some of the questions we had, there were a couple of questions about polar bears. Should we introduce polar bears into the Antarctic, for example? And there was a nice response to that on the forum that said, but this would cause damage to the Antarctic ecosystems. And of course, depending on your viewpoint, then, if all you want to do is preserve the polar bear, maybe you should say, well, we should introduce it everywhere, and that maximizes its chance of surviving somewhere on the planet. Whereas if you were thinking about maintaining ecosystems, you would say we should probably be very cautious about moving species around. So it's a very interesting set of questions, really. I mean, and then the habitat is sort of somewhere in between. And I think that the reason that makes a lot of sense is because we know the main threat to ecosystems and biodiversity is land use and habitat loss. Of course, it makes a lot of sense then. In practice, probably quite a pragmatic approach is to try to protect units of habitat. And at the simplest level, you can't protect a species if it doesn't have anywhere to live, suitable to live. So I suppose it's a minimum anyway. But all of these things are up in the air, and people, are still debating. Even if you said, well, let's say we tried to conserve ecosystems, and I think the IUCN, for example, who lists the world's species as threatened and endangered, you'd have heard that language, critically endangered and so on. They're also moving on to classifying habitats and ecosystems as endangered and so on. But it's really challenging to do. And how, for instance, do you measure the health of an ecosystem? How do you decide? How do you measure the extent to which it's damaged? How do you decide when you've restored it, and how do you show that, and so on? So in practice, ecosystem-based conservation is at the moment quite challenging to do. But in the end, I would hope that it's the direction we go, because ultimately that is what we're trying to preserve. You know, the full interactivity and collection of species and their interactions together, not just a few focal species. Yeah.
And it was Francis who asked that question, so I'm happy to acknowledge that now.
Yes, thanks. Sorry, I know I'm losing track of a few of my questions.
There was a question from Patrick about reintroduction, which is also interesting. And the Scottish landowner who wants to reintroduce wolves, bears, and wild boar.
Yeah.
I've seen the beaver colonies in Scotland, which is another reintroduction. And it raises the interesting point about whether you can really go backwards and restore ecosystems by bringing back animals or plants that have already disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit like invasive species, it's another really interesting area, you know, both in terms of the applications and in terms of the fundamental questions. So like you said, you know, can we, even if you decided you wanted to do that, to restore the Scottish ecosystems to some pristine state, how would you go about doing it? You know, how would you assemble that ecosystem, and is it sort of possible to do it, or actually is it, you know, can you not do it, like you said, David? But there are a couple of other major questions. Of course, one idea is the pristine. You know, what is the pristine state? You know, philosophically, does it exist? And secondly, even if it did exist, do we know what it looked like? And to give you an idea of the problem of that is that after the last ice age, when the forests of Britain formed again after the glacial maximum, so the tree species were coming up from Europe from their glacial refuges. So there were warmer places where the trees had survived. They migrated back to Britain, and they came in as the climate warmed. But people were there right then, at that point, and they were hunting the animals that were eating the plants and moving the seeds around. They were probably very quickly learned to use fire, for example, like that as part of ecosystem management. They're probably doing more localized things like damming and clearing and so on. So actually, the truth is, to some extent, and actually to a large extent, after the last glacial maximum, the ecosystems of Britain formed with humans as part of the system. So to what extent, what do we mean by the pristine? Do we mean what it looked like a couple of thousand years after that got started, by which stage we probably got rid of most of the megafauna that were here, right? The charismatic megafauna that they used to be. We hunted them all out, the mammoths and so on. Or do we mean perhaps, well, how the system looked a full glacial period before that? Because there were other periods of glacial maximum, and there were other periods when, long before that, when the ecosystems of Britain formed, where people weren't there. So is that what we mean by the pristine? And either way, you know, even if we decide what we mean, how can we actually work out what Britain looked like 10,000 years ago? You know, just from pollen studies. I mean, we've done a pretty good job actually of working some of this stuff out. But that's right. So there's one real challenge there. I think another one for me, there's a big change as well between the idea of introducing the exact species that were there before but have been lost. So like the introduction of the beavers in northeast England would be an example, or in Scotland, because there were beavers there, and we can reintroduce beavers. And I mean, there's still genetic issues. They might not be exactly the same, but at least there's the same species. But there's also this idea of rewilding, where we actually introduce analog species. So we introduce species that we think are performing a similar role, got a similar niche, but are not actually the same species. And this is a topic of, for instance, there used to be megafauna in the United States. And then when people arrived there about 12,000 years ago, they all disappeared. Some combination of climate change and hunting. Well, should we take some of the African megafauna there, things like giraffes and elephants, which seem to have done seem to do a similar thing to those now extinct things, and actually introduce them into America? And that's it, you know, and people are talking about this. And I mean, you know, who knows? I mean, you know, you can see the arguments. You could say, well, these roles are missing from the ecosystem, and so they should be there. Whereas someone else would go, this is crazy to deliberately introduce invasive species into the US. You know, you know, it's an interesting topic anyway. And I mean, I'm not aware of anyone doing it yet, by the way, the rewilding. So it's certainly an interesting topic.
It's an interesting idea, isn't it, that if you like a top carnivore, you you reintroduce one, and it's not too important which one you reintroduce.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It all makes sense on paper, doesn't it? It sounds fine. I would worry a little bit. I think a lot of people would. What would happen in reality? You know, we talked about the complexity of ecosystems and how, you know, some unexpected, you know, the unexpected knock-on effects that can come from the interactions.
And one other little point aside from what you've just said, which is that, of course, humans arrived in Britain, and then they died out. So the current population, if you like, is actually a reintroduction that we reintroduced ourselves.
I'm going to be very honest in public now, David. So I wasn't aware of that. Thanks for letting me know. So yes, again, that changes things, doesn't it?
So Fran asked about whether we think that the current need or drive to protect species and habitats, which we've just been talking about, is driven by emotion. Do we emotionally feel that we should do this? I mean, there is quite a lot of emotion involved. People who want to see animals back where they say they belong. But I think there's now many of the decisions are being driven by hard information, because we're accumulating information more and more, and are better able to take considered decisions rather than emotional ones.
Yes, I mean, I certainly feel that difference, even in the relatively short time. About 15 years I've been an ecologist now, and even in that relatively short time, I see that shift to, you know, more of the, for instance, the NGOs and charities and so on involved in conservation, or the government agencies. Increasingly, it's based on a more logical argument about things like biodiversity, ecosystem services, and so on, and you know, and as we mentioned, just recognize the fact that you don't just go for some favorite species, but you think about the whole ecosystem. It seems to me that different agencies are working together more. So this is what I hear. So you don't necessarily have, you know, one arguing for protecting the birds and another arguing for protecting the plants, but increasingly realizing that they should work together to protect the whole assemblage, even if that might mean that some particular bird perhaps doesn't do quite as well, or some particular plant, but thinking let's think about the whole system. On another level, I suppose, though, you would have to say that Francis' point is right, which is that ultimately the choice of what we want to achieve in managing and protecting ecosystems does have to come from humans. And I suppose, you know, it's just part of the reality of this is that we have to admit, I think, that we have to say what would we like to achieve, you know, whether that is some notion of conserving ecosystems or species, or for instance maintaining ecosystem services, because that might lead us in quite different directions. So I suppose ultimately it is a value question. You know, somehow as a society we have to have that discussion about our values to decide what we would like, which is perhaps slightly uncomfortable, because it's a nice idea that there'd be some very logical scientific way to make these decisions, but at that top level we humans are in charge. I guess that's the point, and so we have to be prepared to make a decision, don't we?
Yeah. So I've selected a few questions. Have you got some more that you would like to?
Yes, that's right. So there was a question here about a very short one from Daniel Turner. What's your view of Lovelock's Gaia theory? And I think this is a very interesting idea, and has a really interesting history, actually. So in a nutshell, James Lovelock's theory was that all of these interactions that somehow form life on the planet, the net effect of that would be to sort of regulate especially the physical environment, to keep it suitable for life, if you like. And this caused, and at the time, this was, I think it is important to understand the history, because he introduced his theory at around the time that Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene was very popular, and also around the time that Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as community. And I do think that's actually relevant. It was a very individualistic time. And this idea that somehow there might be some sort of higher level organizing principles for life, especially going as far as that it would somehow protect itself, was just really viewed as crazy by most people, including most ecologists and so on. But to be honest, in the years since then, I think that actually people have increasingly thought that this is not quite such a ridiculous idea, that it's an interesting way to think about things. Because really, I don't know if the concept of feedbacks has come up too much in the course so far, but this idea that, so you have positive and negative feedback. So a positive feedback is if I do something, kind of gets amplified. It's like a vicious circle. And a negative feedback is if I do something, the system pushes back. And really, all James Lovelock's theory is that negative feedbacks prevail in nature. And if that's the case, then the things we do, nature will tend to push back. And there are many reasons for thinking that often the negative feedbacks would prevail. So I won't go too far on that, but just to say that, and of course, interestingly, you could argue that in, for instance, evolutionary theory, there's more and more talk again about group selection, and kin selection, and altruism. That's kind of been rehabilitated a bit. So actually, the individualistic view in evolution we're moving back a bit the other way to thinking about groups again. And of course, in politics as well. It's a little bit less of an individualistic time than it was then. So I think it's a very interesting question. I think, and I'd encourage people to look into the history of that a bit. But so it's, again, in a nutshell, I think that more and more serious ecologists are starting to take James Lovelock's ideas a bit more seriously, and I think it won't be just a wholehearted acceptance of exactly what he said, but I think his concepts are becoming sort of integrated back into mainstream ecology again. So I think that's a really interesting thing to look into. I mean, a couple of other things, if you'd like me to. I mean, one of the ones who had a couple of questions about permaculture.
Yes.
Jacqueline Fletcher, do you think that we can use permaculture as a sustainable means of small-scale farming that would also be a form of conservation? And Helga Kare saying, have you come across permaculture and what do you think about its approach to managing an environment? So, I mean, I would say, as an individual, I don't know too much about exactly how permaculture has been tried, but I do think as a concept it's very interesting because it seeks to so there are several key differences between natural ecosystems, or mostly natural ones, and the sort of semi-natural ones that we depend on for things like food. Because of course, let's not forget, a farm is also an ecosystem, or let's say a fish farm, or a field full of cows that are being grazed for meat. These are all ecosystems, but there's a huge difference between these two. So that in general, with the artificial ones, we tend to dump a lot of material taken from the outside onto those systems. And then there's a lot of loss of a lot of that material out into the environment. So they're kind of a bit of a throughput system. And many more of the natural systems have a lot more cycling mechanisms to keep the resources inside the system. That was, in fact, almost the definition of an ecosystem I saw on the discussion that you had early on in the course, was saying by and large it's about collections of strongly interacting individuals that kind of keep the energy and nutrient cycling among them and don't lose it. And so, for example, we sometimes lose as much as 75% of the nitrogen that we put onto our fields drains off into the river system. Whereas in natural temperate forests, for example, without nitrogen pollution, the amount of nitrogen that drains out of the ecosystem is almost zero, practically zero. So if you go down to places like Chile, where they have temperate forests in the south with very little nitrogen input, there's almost no nitrogen loss from the system. And so I think then the idea of what permaculture, my understanding is, it's stressing the idea that we should try to look to natural ecosystems as a way to try to create more sustainable semi-natural systems. So could we alter the way we farm so that we can retain that nitrogen, so we don't have to fix so much, which is very energy intensive, and then lose so much and pollute downstream systems and so on. So I think as a general idea, it's fantastic, the idea of permaculture. Whether it needs to be small scale, I think that's a completely separate idea. It might have been small scale up to now, but that's probably because it's a bit unorthodox. But there's no reason why some of those concepts couldn't be rolled out into our mainstream farming, in principle. So it's a really interesting question. Again, probably something that'd be really worth looking into, and also probably something that, again, perhaps would have been seen as a bit wacky, 10, 20 years ago, a bit sort of hippie-ish, a bit alternative, and so on, and dismissed. And I think now, there are more and more serious, not just ecologists, but economists and people that are thinking about food security that would take ideas like that really seriously now. That they recognise that the way we're farming isn't sustainable and it needs to be changed.
Well, I'd like to just to answer one of the more detailed questions that we've had, because we've been dealing a lot with the global ones. Someone really getting down to the detail of what, I think it's Paul who asks, what thing or event most prompted you to develop the ecosystems course? And the thing that, to answer that, what really struck me was the World Heritage Site, the Galapagos, when I first went there and saw for myself the amazing animals and plants and the threats that they were under. And that was what got me really interested in ecosystems and producing courses about them. And also when I went to Antarctica and saw both the animals there and the threats that some of them have been under in the past, particularly all the abandoned whaling station in the Antarctic. Those two events really persuaded me that we ought to make something about ecosystems that was widely available.
Well, that's really interesting to hear. I mean, actually, in my case, people might be interested to hear that I sort of came from the other side. So I did like being outside when I was a kid and so on. But actually, I also used to do a lot of computer programming and read books about things like electronics and so on. And then as part of that, I started reading about something called artificial life, which is this idea of simulating lifelike processes in a computer. And then it was through that I became increasingly interested in real life. And I'm sure, and so I had some very good teachers as well. So I had a teacher called Richard Heppel, for example, who gave me a copy of the classic ecology textbook, Beggan, Harper and Townsend. And then from then I ended up studying ecology at university, and then we had a lot of field courses, and I absolutely loved those. And so for me, it was kind of coming in sort of from the other side, actually, David. And now so I've sort of started off with a very dry, abstract thing and become increasingly interested in real ecosystems, and now becoming increasingly interested in what we can do about things like conservation and food security and actually managing real ecosystems. So it's it's kind of the opposite direction of travel, but I guess we got to a similar place. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to finish off just by picking up on the people who've mentioned citizen science, and that's one of the things that we've been pushing in week 4, where everybody was encouraged to go out and look for 4 organisms in their local habitat, photograph them, get them identified through the iSpot website, and then consider the links between the 4 organisms that they'd found. And I think citizen science has an increasing role to play. There's a very important set of data on the date at which oak tree buds burst each year, and someone has been collecting that data for over 40 years. Mm-hmm. The longest continuous data set that we have about one event that's related to the seasons. And there are all sorts of ways in which you can contribute to these big data sets, and the more data that you get, and the more accurate things like the location and the timing and temperature are, for example, then the better we'll be able to understand the changes that occur as perhaps the climate changes over long periods.
Yeah, so I would definitely second that. I mean, in my main job, my day job, I do a lot of ecological modelling. So we try to put together what we know about species and ecosystems to come up with simulation models of them in the computer, And one of the main things we're limited by is just the lack of data. So we have a lot of data that's relevant to ecology, things like climate and elevation, things like that, soil maps and so on. We have only small amounts of data really on where species are, so lists of species in local places. So the more of that we could get, fantastic. We have almost no data on interactions, which is really what the science is about. Very, very few observations where people say, I saw, a fox catch a rabbit here at this time, which is really the kind of stuff that ecology is about. So, and I totally agree that citizen science, and coupled with some other things like our ability to do things like machine learning on data and automatic recognition from species, so some technological things too, so the citizen science and the technology together, might for the first time really give us suddenly, a sudden jump in the amount of ecological data that we have about the real world. So I would definitely encourage people to, to get involved in those, or even to start some of their own if they think that if that's something they'd be interested in doing. So, and it's great that the OU, Open University, has been heavily involved in that, including iSpot, for example. But you mentioned the tree survey one as well, and I'm sure there are several others. So yeah, I would very much second that.
We haven't been able to answer all the questions, I'm afraid. I hope we've covered most of the areas that have been raised. So I hope that you found that very useful. I'd like to thank you, Drew, for coming in and contributing to the discussion on behalf of the British Ecological Society. There will be a blog post about this question and answer session later on, and do keep adding questions to the discussion forums on Introduction to Ecosystems. I hope you've enjoyed this, but I'm afraid we've reached the end of the questions that we can answer in the time available. So thank you very much. Thanks very much, Drew.
Thank you, David. It was really interesting. Thanks for the invite.
And goodbye.
Bye.